Well, we begin in South Sudan, where the U.S. has imposed sanctions against senior government officials and 3 companies. The U.S. claims they are spurring the ongoing conflict in the country. Those targeted include the Deputy Defense Chief, Malek Reuben, Information Minister, Michael Makuei Lueth, and former Military Chief of Staff, Paul Malong. The 3 firms implicated are owned by Reuben. The sanctions freeze any assets they may have in U.S. jurisdictions, ban them from traveling to the United States, and prevent Americans from doing business with them. The U.S. Treasury Department has also warned banks not to conduct business with any of the implicated officials or companies. Well, let's now get you more insight and analysis on these developments. John Gashie is a veteran journalist and expert on South Sudan affairs. He joins us live here in studio. John, what do you make of these latest rounds of sanctions and the individuals that have been targeted?
Thank you. Let me say from the outset, it's a very positive development. And it's perhaps an indication that the international community is, and specifically the U.S., has, in my view, decided to show a bit of teeth, so to speak. And perhaps the message that is going to the main players in South Sudan is that perhaps the honeymoon, so to speak, for lack of a better term, is over. And we are, and the international community, and specifically the South Sudanese and people in the region, you'll be hoping that there will be more follow-up and perhaps and more bite, so to speak. It's been long in coming. It's taken quite a while, and possibly the individuals that are here or targeted, I would say they are very close to power, and it's a good sign in that regard.
All right.
Yeah.
Maybe looking back at previous sanctions in past years, they've maybe had little impact in the past on the security situation in South Sudan. Would you say that this time around you're expecting different results?
I wouldn't be too optimistic. Let me put it perhaps in the context that it's more one-sided, so to speak, in that the Minister for Information, Makuei, is in many ways perceived as one of the hardliners, the intellectual praise singer, so to speak, and perhaps the leading in my view, peaceful resolution in that regard. The former Chief of General Staff is, in my view, now possibly having his comeuppance, so to speak. But the current, Deputy Chief of Staff was somebody perhaps under the radar, so to speak. But now that he is that senior and high up, the message being sent to the military is that we would be coming for you. But I would say that perhaps it was, in my view, and for the people of South Sudan, possibly a little late in coming, but perhaps better late than never in that regard.
Okay.
And possibly would these then have an impact on the government level? Possibly there will be a review. There possibly will be a reconsideration. But I also get the feeling that they are too entrenched, as it were, that they are going for what we call a sub-zero game. Perhaps this ought not to have been allowed in the first instance, but as I would say, it's better late than never, but we will still wait and see whether this will really trigger tectonic plate movement in the peace process.
Okay. Now, up until this point, the sanctions have been led by the United States and Western nations. Do you think that by bringing it closer to home, the African Union and South Sudan's neighbors in the region will have a different approach this time round?
How I pray in that really ought to have happened. And indeed, perhaps it's quite evident that for these sanctions, led by the U.S. and the Western world and possibly even other major players, without the involvement, the coordination with countries like, and I would say this certainly, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia and Sudan. But perhaps for me, specifically, is that Kenya really carries a lot of weight in this regard. Kenya and Uganda. Put it this way, and I think Kenya and Uganda are key trading partners. And we have a huge number of South Sudanese on both across the divide here. The tragic thing is that they fight, they kill, they do this, and then they come to Nairobi for rest and recreation. It is that absurd that they use Kenya, Kampala, as capitals in which, after they've committed all these atrocities, they come in to have rest and recreation, to go and have, their massage. It's absurd in that regard, and it's tragic, and possibly we are hoping that then IGAD, we are hoping that the African Union, we are hoping that this could have been coordinated, and it needs to be done, and done fast. Perhaps we could only hope that then our leadership in the region will be able to follow suit and put their money where their mouths are, and hold these characters to account, targeted. It's sad that they have their children, they get into all these issues, and they come to Kenya, Kampala, and Addis Ababa to have massage. It's ridiculous.
All right, John Gashia, thank you very much for those insights. Political analyst and South Sudanese affairs analyst, indeed, John Gashia, speaking to us live here in Nairobi on the situation in South Sudan.